Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah Seidman, the Puffin Foundation Curator of Social Activism at the Museum of the City of New York. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for Envisioning Alternatives to Policing, Mental Health. We are honored to be joined tonight by our moderator, Ashley Southall, along with panelists Christina Sparak, Ruth Lowenkron, and Tim Black. This is the first in our three-part series with Ashley moderating. Tune back in on April 27th for a discussion on alternatives to policing and violence prevention, and on May 26th on alternatives to policing and quality of life in public spaces. You can find more on the series on our website, mcny.org, as well as the recording of the program last summer that this series follows up on, New York's Communities of Color and the Police, a Historical Perspective. Before we dive into discussing our current moment, I'd like to thank the Puffin Foundation for their generous support of Activist New York and its programming, of which this event is a part. And I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in. And for those who are able to donate for this event, we truly appreciate your support of the museum as we continue to navigate this challenging time. The museum is currently open Friday to Sunday, with safety and distancing guidelines in place. So I invite you to visit Activist New York, the ongoing exhibition at the museum. If you're so inclined, or to come back in the future, you can also see the exhibition online at activistnewyork.mcny.org. Both online and in person include a section on the movement for Black Lives, which explores some of the same topics as tonight's program through objects and images. Closed captioning will be available tonight. You can enable it at the bottom of your screen. We'll be taking questions from the audience on Zoom, so you can send along any questions that you may have in the Q&A function. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Christina Sparak is a certified public accountant and the former Deputy Bureau Chief of Financial Reporting at the Office of the Comptroller under John Liu. As a mental health advocate, advocating for non-police responses to mental health crises, she has participated in the New York Police Department and Department of Corrections Crisis Intervention Team Program, the Health Promotion for Justice Impacted Populations Committee of the New York City Community Service Board, Mayor de Blasio's Crisis Prevention and Response Task Force, and Correct Crisis Intervention Today, or CCIT NYC. Ruth Lowenkron is the director of the Disability Justice Program at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. Lowenkron has been active in the field of disability law since 1981, having worked at Untapped Resources, Inc., and in New Jersey, the Community Health Law Project, the Education Law Center, and Disability Rights, New Jersey. Lowenkron has assisted persons with physical, mental, and other disabilities via impact litigation, legislative advocacy, and community outreach, and has taught disability law at Seton Hall Law School and CUNY Law School, and is a special education hearing officer for the New York State Department of Education. Lowenkron was recently named by Crain's New York Business as a notable woman in law. Tim Black is the director of consulting at Whitebird Clinic in Eugene, Oregon. With a background in runaway and homeless youth, harm reduction, and street outreach, he first worked for the clinic's program Cahoots, Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets, as a crisis intervention worker. Programs based on the Cahoots model have been implemented in Olympia, Washington, Denver, Rochester, New York, San Francisco, and Portland. In addition to his work with Whitebird Clinic, Tim is active in homeless advocacy and also serves on the board of directors for Eugene's community supported shelters. And finally, Ashley Southall is a law enforcement reporter focused on crime and policing in New York City, a beat she started in 2016. She joined the Times in 2008 as a news clerk in the newspaper's Washington Bureau. Southall is an alumna of Howard University and an Alabamian. Thank you for joining us tonight for this essential conversation. Please join me in welcoming our panel, and I will now turn the virtual mic over to our moderator, Ashley.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for everyone who's joining us this evening. The first thing I'm going to start with some data on police responses. Last year, the police responded to 8.3 million 911 calls. And just 167,000 of those, or about 2%, were calls for people who were experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. And that about 1 out of every 4 of those calls involved someone who had some sort of a weapon, but 3 out of 4 did not. And what that means for our panelists is that there's a huge opportunity to try a different approach to mental health in New York City. And that's what we're going to discuss tonight. So I'm going to start with Christina, and would like to know from you, Christina, what the police response is like for the person who is experiencing a mental health episode.
Thank you for asking me that question, Ashley. I'm going to start probably sharing my story of lived experience as a person who lives with bipolar disorder. When the police responded to me, it was actually really scary. They show up to a mental health call like it's a crime scene where there's sirens and there's multiple cops and they're armed and they have tasers and they have their uniforms and they're big guys. In my crisis situation, I was triggered by PPTs, people, places, and things, which is a traumatic event for me. And so my brain starts racing and I have multiple voices in my head and I just can't stop them. They continue to get louder and louder. And I pace throughout my apartment and just out of control screaming. And I just can't snap out of it just like that. So now the police are present in my house, but I'm still hearing my voices, but they're giving me commands, repeated commands to like probably sit down or, relax or whatever commands they're giving me, but I can't hear because my voice are dominating my conversation in my head. So the police are looking for voluntary compliance immediately, but again, I can't. So what they do is they start to have more firm and stern approaches and louder voices, and the position, their body language is more firm about me trying to comply immediately, but I can't. So they end up escalating the situation where I may just react where they don't want me to react, and I can end up getting harm. And so basically it's like more of a lose-lose situation because police respond to EDP calls, emotionally disturbed people. And I'm not emotionally disturbed, I'm a person first. But in their book, they call me EDP, and they also respond to criminals. So I have 2 strikes against me. So it seems like it's a lose-lose situation, and it's not good when the police respond to people living with mental health conditions.
And Ruth, you've kind of examined this issue from the legal front and activist front. And one of the things that you have done is obtained body camera footage and studied it. What can you tell us about how these calls play out, especially when they lead to pretty lethal encounters? You're muted.
Of course I'm muted. All right, Andy, the evening begins. Pardon me. I think the best way to start is by very, very from the bottom of my heart saying, thank God Christina is alive. Yeah. Because the reality is that other people who have similar issues as Christina has described have ended up shot or shot dead. And the statistics are abysmal. In the last 5 years alone, we've had 16 individuals shot and killed at the hands of the police, 14 of them people of color. So we're talking about a real crisis, a crisis of mental health crises, essentially. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that neither the individual who's experiencing a mental health crisis nor their family members, loved ones, have any choice about whom to call. They want to have help for the loved one. They want to have help for themselves. They call 911. That's the only option available for some sort of immediate response. Mm-hmm. And that gets you the police. And I can give you all the various analogies we've talked about. If you having a heart attack, do you want the police? If you're, a rocket scientist, I'm not good with those analogies. Bottom line is, if you're having a mental health crisis, you do not want the police because the likelihood of them escalating is greater than them de-escalating. And as you mentioned, under the heading of Picture Worth 1,000 Words, my office, New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, along with Pro Bono Counsel, the Milbank firm, we have been able to get, with great difficulty, in fact, as you said, footage from body-worn cameras of police officers who have shot and killed individuals. And truly, if you take even 1 second's look at how that tape begins, you know this is going in the wrong direction. You can tell from the voices of the police, sit down, go here, much as Christina was saying, but you actually hear the shouting and it gets louder and more intense as there's no cooperation from their perspective. So very quickly, in the instance of Miguel Richards, he was standing perfectly quietly in the room, not saying a word, not moving an inch, and yet with all of the shouting, they were not successful, no surprise, in de-escalating. They escalate and he ends up dead. So I have a lot more to say, but I get the sense that that we should move on. But the bottom line is that this is all too usual of a response.
Mm. And that brings us to Tim. You know, when we talk about alternatives and taking this from the police, people often don't know what to imagine the response might be. Can you tell us a bit about what Cahoots and Whitebird Clinic does differently?
Yeah, you know, something that really resonated for me when Christina started talking was about that just the visuals, right, of having these patrol cars and these big intimidating uniformed officers show up for this crisis situation where somebody's really, you know, feeling vulnerable and threatened, right? You know, before that interaction has already started. And that's one of the things that we really recognized and motivated us to bring the Cahoots program into mobile crisis here in Eugene and Springfield. And that's that, you know, we utilize these civilian response teams where we have an EMT and a crisis worker, you know, somebody ideally even with lived experience who's gotten training to be that responder. Our teams respond to calls for service that are dispatched through public safety. As Ruth mentioned, you know, folks generally have a tendency to call 911, right? Or to call the police when there is a crisis unfolding, either because that's what they're experiencing or what they're seeing. And we have this expectation that police are just going to continue to handle all of these different situations, even though there's not a crime being committed, there's not a need for enforcement. And so by having these civilian first responder teams integrated into our public safety system, Cahoots can respond to, you know, crises stemming from not just mental health, but substance use, you know, poverty, housing, you know, lack of resources, right? And really provide alternatives, not just to that initial response of who's showing up, but even what happens after, you know, a responder has shown up on scene. Cahoots teams aren't obligated just to take somebody to the hospital or jail or leave them on scene, right? You know, Cahoots teams are able to get folks connected to the resources and the services they need to address both the trigger of that crisis, but also to identify and implement support so that the next time that trigger is encountered, maybe the trauma response isn't so severe, right? And that there's that opportunity for us to start to de-escalate these situations and even, you know, kind of create a system that will de-escalate future crises unfolding. Our presence in the public safety system is also, you know, keeping folks out of jail and out of the hospital system too. And I'm sure there'll be some opportunity later on in this discussion to really drill in on the financial impact as well as the very human impact, you know, that our program has in our community.
Mm-hmm. I just want to take note of something you said, which is that you also deal with substance abuse or substance use disorders. And that is something that is kind of often heavily intertwined with mental health needs. And one of the things that, you know, I as a reporter see when I'm looking at the NYPD's use of force reports is how often people who die in police custody have some form of drugs or alcohol in their system. And unfortunately, those kind of just go completely left and those people don't make it out of it. So what I want to ask you, Tim, is, you know, a lot of places now are giving a second look to what they use their police for and how they can offer or try a different approach. And I know that Cahoots has been mentioned everywhere. So what are they coming to you and asking? What kind of challenges are they trying to address?
Yeah, you know, one of the biggest things that we encounter is this question around where the funding is going to come from, you know, for a program like this. And, you know, there is a price tag associated with this. We have our services here in Eugene and Springfield, and it costs about $2.5 million a year to run. we're saving our community in the form of criminal legal diversion around $8 million a year. When it comes to diversion from the hospital and reduced ambulance rides, there's another $14 million that's being saved. So really, for every dollar being spent on the program, about $10 are going back into the community. And so there's that, there's that very, fiduciary, kind of responsibility to make sure that there's the resources to fund this kind of a resource. Another place where the cost savings come in is fewer lawsuits, fewer settlements, fewer payouts that a police department is potentially encountering by having a Cahoots-style response program. Outside of those questions around really how does the funding work, what we really start to encounter is a lot of misperception and misunderstanding of the issues. That there is this perception of these crisis situations being unsafe for the responders, and that is really predicated on decades of reinforcement that police officers need to be, warriors, and that they should assume that every interaction, whether it's a traffic stop with a little old lady or, somebody, ranting and screaming on a street corner, those both have the potential to become fatal interactions. And so officers are really conditioned to approach every situation as though it's going to be unsafe. And what that does is it really reduces somebody experiencing a crisis to what that presentation is in that moment, that, this person has all of a sudden become, their entire identity is assumed to be, a handful of symptoms, right? That behavioral health presentation that they have right there. And so a lot of our work with other communities is really really challenging those perceptions and identifying that, what we're really seeing is the result of, unmitigated trauma, and the inability for folks to access the resources to meet basic human needs like sleep, food, hygiene, and these confluence of factors, allowing to be untended to is what has, created the situation where Cahoots-style crisis teams are required.
Mm-hmm. Ruth, thanks, Tim. Ruth, that's some of the stuff that you and I have talked about in phone call after phone call after phone call. Can you kind of talk about, based on what Tim said, how New York is grappling with this issue and how to address it?
Don't say it. I did it. It's really interesting. I think if people are listening to the panel, they heard Sarah talk about the numerous cities that are adopting these models. There are actually many more. Things look very rosy, right? Mm-hmm. But this is happening all of a sudden, and it's exciting because I think a lot of it is the killing of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement. And all of a sudden, people are sort of getting it that we need to think about different ways to deal with safety, health, and so on. And all of that is great. But New York is just being a little slower, shall we say. And they've had quite the head start. Christina and I work together in a coalition called Correct Crisis Intervention Today, New York City. I've been working there 4.5 years, and Christina even longer. The group's been in existence about 8 years, and this is our sole mission. And really, we're stuck dealing with the crisis end of it. I hope later we'll get to talk about the fact that if you have good services in place, we wouldn't even have to be dealing with crises, but we're stuck having to deal with these crises. And the point I want to make is we've been dealing with this for almost a decade. And considering that is the case, we are really not in a great place. Mm-hmm. On a positive note, the public advocate has come out forcefully with a report about 2 years ago. Excellent report. The comptroller has come out with great statements. The attorney general has come out with a great statement. But where is the city? The city is offering to put together a pilot. It's under the Thrive administration. And in a real nutshell, we have huge problems with it. Why? For one thing, they did not listen to us in the community. They did reach out to Tim. They know all about Cahoots. Everybody seems to know about Cahoots, which is great, but they don't all think that they should model their programs. And certainly New York City has not done that sufficiently. Mm-hmm. So they didn't have the community input they should have. They don't want to have the peer input, peer is what we call individuals with lived mental health experience. Christina will talk more about why that's so critical. They don't have that in any kind of a formal way. They continue, even though they say they would like to try and remove police to some extent, they still involve 911, which is a police response. They also want to involve the Fire Department of New York and the emergency medical service professionals who are part of the team that has been responding up to this date. So it's not a very big movement, even if there weren't the 911 police part. So you have instead one bureaucracy traded off for the other. And the other two huge things about Thrive is that it's not even going to be run 24 hours. So you kind of have to time your mental health crisis. I kid you not. And the other thing is that they are also not even going to respond with the same timeliness as they do for anyone who has had a crisis that is not related to mental health. Mm-hmm. And that to us is just flat out discrimination. How do you decide that a mental health crisis is less worthy of an accelerated response? So that is a big piece of what the city is doing. There's a lot else going on. I'll just mention really, really quickly, City Council has a bill out there. I'm cautiously optimistic. They have said they want to have input from us. I've testified twice already there. I have also been speaking with people that there might be some movement, but there you have a huge definitional problem about when the police can come out, namely when there's something as vague as violence, undefined, danger to the public, undefined. So that is a huge problem there. The 30-minute response time is also a problem, run by another city agency instead of by the community where there is that connection to individuals. That is also a problem with the city council. There's also something on the state level. It's known as Daniel's Law. That I'm much more optimistic about. It's not as far along. It's not being rushed. And also there, we're being invited in really fully. And finally, there's something on the federal level, and I haven't even had a moment to look at it because all of these others are moving so quickly. So that's all of which is it affects what will be going on in New York City.
Would it be accurate to say that there is a reticence to take drastic action at the city level? And if so, Tim, how did Oregon or how other places who adopted your program or a model similar to that kind of overcome that?
Yeah, the thing that's really helped overcome that reluctance that we see from a lot of leadership is to have some inside champions. You know, some folks who have positions of power and authority, you know, within a city system who can really provide that advocacy. When we supported the work going on in Olympia, Washington with their crisis response unit, it was because their chief of police had been a lieutenant down here in Eugene when our program first got started. In Denver, having, you know, support and an endorsement from both dispatch supervision as well as public safety really allowed the STAR program, you know, a powerful foundation. So it's really about kind of finding those folks, you know, within both to, champion the cause, but also to be that person that you go directly to and say, hey, you know, we're holding you accountable. You made this commitment. You're not following through. We got to change this. You know, and one of the things that we see is where that helps out is in the federal legislation, right? The whole big stimulus package within the American Recovery Plan, there is a set of funding set aside as a down payment to fund at the federal level mobile crisis programs inspired by Cahoots. But the language that's in that federal bill is really restrictive, and it mandates that you have to be 24 hours right out of the gate, and that, you know, it can only be staffed with behavioral health professionals, which is really limiting, you know, as far as how, you know, as Ruth said, communities could be involved in really implementing these services. And so this is an opportunity for us to now engage with our elected leadership and say, hey, you know, you were championing this cause. We don't like this product that's coming out. We really got to work on it and address these concerns that we have.
Mm-hmm. And Christina or Ruth, can you tell me, does the mental health advocacy community have allies on the inside? I mean, you mentioned the public advocate, but in terms of in the administration and in the police department in particular, do you have allies who are supportive of this non-police response that you would like to reach?
Insufficiently so, shall we just say, up to this point. And it's something that, you know, we encourage everyone in the audience who's concerned about it we will share some information later about how they can be involved in this and push people like Susan Herman, the head of the Thrive office to do the right thing and have a real non-police response when the literature shows us and the reality of Tim Black's program shows us that that's the way to save lives. I mean, I almost know Tim's stats probably as well as him because I tout them so often, but how long they've been in existence, over 30 years, how few people have been hurt, not a one injured in any serious fashion on either side of a provider or of an individual experiencing a crisis. That is huge. That is amazing. And we've got to replicate that here in New York City and pronto.
Mm-hmm. Christina, do you want to add anything to that?
No, Ruth summed it up. Thank you, Ruth.
Okay. So a lot of the discussion about mental health and the police response focuses on people in crises. But let's talk about what happens before it gets to that point. First, I'm going to talk about some things that happened today, which is that the City Council passed a police reform plan put forth by Mayor Bill de Blasio. Lots of people were unhappy with it. But the big issue with this plan is that the administration was supposed to put it forth in December and to give the public and to involve advocates like Ruth and Legal Aid Society and have a strong community input. And a lot of people feel that didn't happen. So the City Council, the mayor didn't put forth this plan until this month, about 2 weeks ago. And the City Council kind of found itself in a bind trying to do something and make it a stronger plan that would bring about meaningful change. So here are 3 things that are relevant to this panel. First, the city is going to spend $30 million to make sure that every school can give children emotional and behavioral support with what they call a trauma-informed approach, which just means being empathetic and sensitive. There's another $14.5 million for a mobile case management system for about 850 people who need kind of intensive interaction. And then there's about $4.5 million for an even more intensive program for people who we kind of talked about in the first half of the panel, who have behaviors that are increasingly unsafe and who have frequent contact with the criminal justice system via arrest and also are often homeless. So altogether, that's about $50 million for mental health services pre-crisis. What I want to ask you, Christina, is about your path to, one, realizing your illness, but also diagnosis and treatment.
All right, so I believe in my situation that I was born with the mental health diagnosis because I'm born with bipolar disorder and PTSD because of my mother. When I was in my mother's womb, she referred to me as the devil in her womb. And at 4 months old, she told me, because I was colicky, she used to shake me a lot. So it's the baby shaking syndrome. And luckily, my father saved me. And I had constant beatings. And she used her religion and Bible scriptures to actually justify her behavior. So in order to escape from this toxic environment and the trauma that I was experiencing, I just went to school. And then I didn't realize I was bottling up all that emotional unwellness until like 2004, when I was working at a very prominent organization. And in my head, I believed I told myself I was going to be the first vice president in the organization, first Black female. And I was just being overworked and then actually discriminated against as well. And then one day I just broke down in my office and started crying incessantly. And I jumped in my car, drove down on Brooklyn Boulevard, and I pulled out my insurance card. And then I called the number and I said, I need help. From that day, they actually connected me with an African-American doctor. And luckily I had good insurance, who was able to actually explain to me about what the trauma is about being Black in America and why I was, subjected to the situation at my workplace and how I was dealing with it. And he helped me with my treatment. But fortunately, it's so unfortunate that that people in our country who are Black, we don't have the type of insurances, the type of doctors available to us, because we only have 4% of Black psychologists available to represent 12% of the Black population. So people of color are not getting the treatment and services they need. Secondly, a lot of times people of color are being misdiagnosed as schizophrenia when they're not. And lastly, a lot of doctors do not take Medicaid or Medicare. So people are not going to get the treatment that they need, even though they have a diagnosis. It's going to be difficult. But for me, I was fortunate to find a doctor, have good insurance, and go for my visits every week, take my medication, and do my exercise and eat healthier. And I wanted to be in recovery, and that's what it meant to me.
You bring up a really interesting point, which is that, for reasons both cultural and economic and social, that a lot of people aren't going to get treatment the way that we provide it through the medical system. And so can you talk about, medicalization as what, but I'm sorry, there are, however, some of us who do receive treatment through the medical system. And can we talk about how you mentioned earlier that there was an issue there that's an obstacle for some people, both for the reasons that we just talked about, the cultural, financial reasons, but also because of the stigma of medicalization. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, I think a lot in particularly in the Black and Brown communities, people don't like labels. And I wasn't caught up on it. I just wanted to have that aha moment. I knew I was unwell. And medication is not for everyone. And see, when you go to a psychiatrist, it's more of they focus on diagnosis, medication, and stability. When you go to a peer or you do a more holistic approach, people look at you as a human being and maybe more herbal, talk therapy, or something else. And I don't really support the medical model. I support more of a person-centered or peer model.
Mm-hmm. Tim, you talked about this a bit in our prep call about something that Christina brings up. Christina, you were talking about looking at a person as the whole human, and Tim, that often involves problems beyond or issues beyond their mental illness. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think a really good way to kind of encapsulate all of that is a pretty standard call that I would go out on when I was first responder with Cahoots would be for somebody who was, really escalated, shouting in a parking lot, throwing belongings around because they had been told they couldn't use the bathroom in that grocery store. And so we would come in, and I remember when I first started, I was like, it just goes somewhere else. Just use a different bathroom. But then as I really had the opportunity to really gain that experience and sit with folks, one example that keeps coming to mind for me is, just that they went in, tried to use the bathroom at a grocery store, were told no, got escalated, and we came in. And what I learned was that, started ending about 2:00 in the morning. So going on 16 hours before, we were having this interaction with Cahoots, this person had been woken up from the first safe place they had found where they thought they could sleep through the night in weeks. They were told they needed to move along, and then were shouted at by this dog walker shining a flashlight in their face until they actually got their belongings together. They spent the rest of the night until sunrise, just trying to find a place to hunker down and get some sleep, being told, no, you can't be here. No, you can't be here. They then wanted to go check mail, but because they were kicked off the bus system, they had to walk 3-4 miles to get to where their mail and messages were. And by the time they got there, the place was closed for lunch. Drop-in hours were over with. And then, it's just a series of just no's, and these just, moments of oppression and marginalization. And really, all of this had been building and just kind of came out as this explosion at this denial of this most basic human need, and had there been easier transportation, right? Had there been a safe place for this person to sleep through the night, where they could have securely, store their belongings and not worry about getting interrupted, that escalation in the parking lot, that Cahoots call, never would have happened in the first place, and we see the same thing going on with all sorts of different resources that if there was better access, we could see less of that desperation, right? That person who can't pass a UA and so they can't stay in the shelter is expressing suicidal ideation because they're desperate, they're out of options, right? And so if there was a low barrier shelter where a drug screen wasn't passing a drug screen wasn't one of the contingencies to stay in the shelter, then there wouldn't have been that suicidal ideation. It's unlikely that that person may have ended up in the hospital or having that Cahoots interaction. And so really, a lot of these crises, a lot of these situations are really about the denial of other basic human needs, the inability, those barriers being too much to overcome, and then really requiring that support from somebody like Cahoots to come in and just find some de-escalation, right? Find some stability in the moment so that we can start to really reprioritize and maybe take a different approach, maybe lean on the supports of the Cahoots team in the morning, or, strategize a better way to access those other resources so that there is more of a support for somebody the next time they encounter those triggers.
Mm-hmm. All right. So it sounds like what you're discussing too, what your commentary is pointing towards is the need for what's called wraparound services, mm-hmm. that not only these people need help with dealing with their illness, but they may need housing, they may need transportation, they may some food. Christina and Ruth, I mean, the way that the services are provided now in New York, is there a strong relationship between the providers of the mental services and those who can also provide the other things that people need?
In my opinion, I don't think we have enough supports in place. I do see a lot of people who transition out of, like, you could say, out of the criminal justice system, and they don't have like transitional housing and supports of food and family. I don't see it as often, but I may be wrong. Ruth, in your experience?
No, I too do not see that kind of a full package that Cahoots is really all about and continues to grow towards making more of a full package as I see it. Mm-hmm. And I guess to me, it's just so profound too to hear what Tim is saying, because I'm going back to his first comment. So why don't you just go find a toilet somewhere else, right? Well, you know what? There are no public toilets in most cities, right? So of course we're going to have those kind of problems, right? So why are we not building a society that is responsive to everyone's needs? I mean, that is like one of the very basic things. I mean, it happens to be something I was involved in 20 years ago. I thought I was like back in the civil rights era of the 60s. You know what? At that point, they were trying to bring about public toilets, and they didn't want to make them accessible to people who have wheelchairs, who use wheelchairs. And I was like, really? We're going to make inaccessible? So anyway, I digress, but to say that those are the basic things we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about, why is this person not having food? Why is there no food available? Why is there no employment available to this person? Why is employment rife with discrimination? The housing we talked about already. So I think that we don't look at a person holistically. We don't look at those bigger services, and we definitely don't even, and we don't even look at the sort of smaller connection, if you will, that you were really asking about, Ashley, which is right there at the moment. Like, how do we respond, and can you get more health services as part of the deal?
Which is preventive intervention, which is great. The health services and all the unmet needs would prevent a crisis, definitely.
Mm-hmm. You both bring me kind of touched on the next question that I have, which is about how to do this better. And Tim, one of the things that you mentioned before is, and one of the things that's come up in this conversation is the reliance on 911. And there's a movement about to change that, not only in several places, but also in Oregon. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, something that we're really excited about here, both at the local and national level, is 988. There needs to be a number that is consistent, right? That doesn't matter if you've lived in that community for 20 years or 20 hours, right? You just impulsive. We all know, call 911 when we need that emergency response. So the possibility of a system like 988 really opens us up to really look at crisis as a public health issue that is separate from law enforcement. We don't have fire departments being dispatched on the same frequencies as police. So why should we have mobile crisis there too? Cahoots has been a part of the public safety system because they're in Eugene, because there hasn't been an alternative. But with 988, what we see is an opportunity for crisis lines, mobile crisis teams, and then other more brick and mortar services to all really be a lot more integrated and to have a lot more seamless connection, and ultimately provide another layer of insulation and protection from folks in crisis, needing to have that unnecessary contact with police.
Mm-hmm. Ruth and Christina, what does an ideal framework look like for New York City?
So CCIT, Correct Crisis Intervention Today, or NYC, is fighting to transform response to mental health calls, is our coalition that we have in New York City. We have about 80 sponsors, and it's actually led by Carla Ribbon, was our advocacy advocacy coordinator. Our framework in New York City for a public health system would look like a peer, a person with lived experience, someone like me, crisis trained, who understands, who thinks, walks, and talks like an individual who has been in crisis and who's also in recovery, who speaks person-centered language, strength-based language, and understands how to validate another human being, a human being, right? Also in this model, we want to have 51% peers from the community to be one of the oversight boards, to be able to like vet through agencies to see if they are giving the quality care and services that we need in the community, or just, you know, for housing and for education, employment, just be able to have the supports of the system that people in the community need to be able to thrive in our communities. And when drafting our proposal, we had 2 forums, which were filled, the room was filled with like 80 people each time, of people who represented the mental health community. And we allowed them to ask questions about everything and allowed them to help us draft the policy, the proposal that we had. In our proposal, we selected 2 precincts. We selected the 14th precinct, which is Midtown South, because they had 4,356 calls in 2018. And Brooklyn, the 75th precinct, which had 5,428 calls in 2018 calls. These are communities that are very hit hard with over-policing and over-criminalization of Black and Brown people. Our teams will be dispatched 24/7, 365 days a year, and the program will cost about $3.5 to $4 million annually. We believe our program works. We have a lot of support from the community, and we're just looking for more legislators to support it as well.
Mm-hmm. Ruth, did you want to add anything to that? Thanks, Christina.
Yeah, just some of the other hallmarks of it are really, you can go back to what I said before, are the problems with the Thrive model, the problems with the New York City Council legislation, and ours are the opposite. So in other words, we're upset that they want to go through 911. We don't think that's the way to go. Our proposal says separate number. We're upset about the idea that you would respond in less time, in greater time for a mental health crisis than for any other crisis. So ours would be the same amount of time, and very heavily leaning on the community organizations being of the community who knows an individual who might have a health crisis. I mean, I think, you know, that is a large part of why Tim Black's Cahoots is so successful. It's his community. It's the workers' community. They're all one. And so that's another real important hallmark of how it would work. Mm-hmm. And it's very much based on the Cahoots model. We're just going to get it better.
Yeah. I have one more question, but first I'm going to turn to our audience. If we have a few questions rolling in. The first question I'm going to ask is one about what should people walking around the city who see someone who's having an apparent mental crisis do other than calling 911?
Right now, we don't have an alternative number, and that's why we're pushing for 988. So we're just, you know, like Ruth mentioned, just start writing to Susan Herman or advocating at City Hall saying we need an alternative number so we can get the supports that we need for our community.
Mm-hmm.
I think something else to really consider is, why do you feel that impulse to call somebody? You see someone experiencing a crisis, that's us, you know, defining that experience for someone else. Just because, you know, somebody is out in public talking to themselves doesn't mean that they need, you know, a crisis team, right? Maybe that's just part of what gets them through the day, you know. And so as we all encounter situations in our community where we got to, you know, we're going, oh God, I need to call. Is it because it's going to help us feel better, you know, about walking away? Is it going to allow us to sit with our privilege, you know, a little bit easier that night? Or is it because we are, you know, really, you know, encountering somebody who is in such a profound crisis, right? They have so much need that's going unmet that they really do need the support of some sort of first response. So taking that moment to really look at what's, you know, kind of triggering that impulse for you is a really important first step, right? Just take a moment, take a breath, and really, yeah, just ask yourself, why did I pull my phone out?
I agree with Tim, because even yesterday I saw somebody with Tourette's syndrome and they were screaming in the street and they were just cursing, cursing, cursing. But being that I'm a person that identifies with people that with lived experience, I didn't stare at him. I didn't look at him awkwardly, but other people did. And I was just like, just on my computer, because he was just a person just going through an experience, because that's the way he lives.
Thank you. Our second question is, what is the resistance about in implementing, what is the resistance about in implementing aggressive reform? It seems like such a win-win situation, but this questioner asked, but knowing the opposition would be helpful for us to know how to approach our own action.
Well, if I'm hearing it correctly, I think maybe that might be a response to Christina outlining our proposal of starting with 2 precincts. But that is one thing where I am very happy to say the city well, I'll say it on both sides of the coin. So we suggested 2 precincts, 2 areas of the city, and Thrive decided that's too much. We're going to only do 1 area of the city. But I was going to tout the New York City Council bill as saying, let's just jump right in and get this going. Now is the time. We're already way behind. We're not going to just serve part of the city. And that's something we absolutely support. So I'm with that questioner who says, yeah, now, if I understand the questioner correctly, now's the time. Jump in, full bore, get this service changed, transform in a big way.
What's the NYPD's position on these types of programs in New York City?
We, I mean, I'm not quite sure how best to respond. I will say that Susan Herman, whose name we've bantered about a bit, as the head of Thrive, comes out of the New York Police Department. So I think she has a lot of the talking points of the New York Police Department. And I think that there is reluctance to suggest that they can't handle this. But I think the reality is, if you go and elbow the cop whom you might know in some which way, what do they feel about responding to crisis? That's not what they want to do. They recognize they're out of their element. And I think Tim could really respond to this best, because he has this wonderful relationship with the cops in Eugene. And I think it will inform, I think, how our cops should think. How's that?
Exactly.
Go ahead,
Tim. And I think I can speak more generally rather than specifically with NYPD, but there is this disconnect that we see a lot of times between supervisors and command staff and line officers. Like Ruth said, most officers who joined a police department didn't sign up because they were really passionate about intervening in mental health situations. They didn't sign up because they're very passionate about working with folks experiencing homelessness. But because there is no other system in place, this is obligated to police, just like there was a time before, EMTs through Freedom House were providing transport without relying on police. Animal welfare officers, right, were an extension of having officers go out and engage with, the stray dog or whatever. And so, there is this recognition by line officers that this is not what the role they should be filling. It's really clear cut, but then you get to unions like the Fraternal Order of Police and command staff really looking at contracts, and there's this: if you reduce the call volume in a police department's contract by too much, then all of a sudden you're in breach of the entire thing, right? And so you can't bring this program in because it's going to take too many calls off the plate of a police department, which means that the city would be violating their own contract, and so it's just these really kind of convoluted. It almost feels like it's desire to kind of stay in the game because you've been in it so long, and there's that investment, right? And defensiveness that we all have when we hear that someone else could do a better job than us. I think that's a normal reaction to say, well, but why? Like, we have these programs, we have this training, but that's also coming through that bias of law enforcement being told and being conditioned as the only, viable response for these behavioral health crises.
But it's not all pride, right? It's sometimes the police come into regardless of if they're responding to mental health calls at all. Sometimes when they respond to, say, an assault or a disorderly person, it often ends up being someone who's in the throes of a mental crisis. And I just wonder how that works with Cahoots. What happens when the police are there or are called to respond, and then they get there and realize, oh, this is somebody, or maybe do they even realize it because they're no longer having these regular contacts with the person?
I would argue, and this is all based on, my personal experience as a responder, but, I would really argue that there is a lot more increased awareness of, common mental health presentations of situations in which Cahoots is going to be the more appropriate response because we've been a part of this system for so long. There's a real easy understanding of how we can play a different role, how we can have better outcomes. Command staff at briefings will say, you need to be calling Cahoots, for these situations. Chiefs that we've worked with here in Eugene and Springfield have issued memorandums saying Cahoots will be the responder for these types of calls. And what we experience as first responders, where police have shown up in these situations and realize this is more appropriate for Cahoots, is that they're more than relieved to have this situation handed over to a Cahoots response team. I've heard officers say, okay, the experts are here, so we're going to leave, right? There's that understanding that there's less paperwork that they got to do, if Cahoots is involved. There's just better outcomes for everybody when we can have the right responders sent to the right situations. And that is one of the benefits of being a part of that public safety system. Being a part of that traditional, means of response means that when police are in these situations where they're not the appropriate resource, there's a very direct line of communication to, the crisis response teams. With 988, we're going to have a little bit more of a, disconnect there, but the other side of that, really kind of outweighs this kind of minimal point of intersection. So yeah, I guess, I'm rambling, but the officers really value, the resource being out there. They're really eager to hand these calls over to us, and they are excited to ask us questions, and really explore why we took that approach. Why did we sit down beside the person instead of stand in front of them, and we can talk about inherent power dynamics and body language. There's a lot of opportunities to process these really complex situations too, and we get to role model, day in and day out, how we talk about these situations on the radio. Officers see us, there's a lot of training, through experience.
Okay. Christina, you were going to say something, but I also want to ask you about what mental health clinicians can do to properly value the peer support model and to get involved with CCIT.
So definitely definitely our website is www.ccitnyc.org. For the peer community, how mental health professionals would do better for us, for people in the community, is definitely hire staff of peer specialists on their staff, treat them as equals, actually observe of how peer specialists engage with clients, because we do practice, again, the person-centered approach. We do active listening. And like Tim mentioned about body language plays a lot into the communication engagement with individuals, because, police showing up or just a practitioner showing up with their arms folded doesn't make you want to open up to an individual because you don't trust them. Peers know how to build trust and with people so they can be more comfortable with sharing their lived experience. And what was your other part of your question? I'm not sure if
it was just about how the clinicians can be more supportive and get involved with CCIT. So I think that you kind of you answered that question. Very quickly, before we get to my last question, which is kind of very important, I just wanted to ask about what role 311 plays in the responses to mental crises. Who do those calls go to? Do they just get rerouted to the police?
For the most part.
Do you have any options right now?
Understanding.
All right. My last question before we go is one that I think that the voters in the forum would benefit from very much. This year, New York is going to choose a new mayor and other elected officials who are going to play a pivotal role in deciding what the future of New York City's mental health response and treatment framework looks like. What do each of you think that voters should be asking them? I'm going to start with Tim and go to Ruth, and Christina, you will have the last word.
Gosh, that's a great question. I really, it comes back to some of the things that, Ruth and Christina and myself have been talking about around what else, is going to be implemented. It's not just the mobile crisis team, but what are the other services that need to be brought into place? Where are the other areas where this reform is going to touch? Addiction. Is there a way for somebody other than officers to help support folks getting into sobering and detox? What's going to happen around low barrier shelter, right? Because if there's a denial of the provision of the most basic human needs, you're going to see an explosion in behavioral health crisis.
Ruth?
Yeah. Just also to point out, by the way, that we had a hugely successful town hall that Christina almost single-handedly put together, where we dealt with the broader mental health issues. And people can take a look at that from the CCIT website. It's very informational, to say the least, where the candidates are already on these issues. But I really do think it should not be at the top of our list, but because of how critical this whole issue of mental health crisis response is, it's got to stay at the top of the list. And we have to get every one of our mayoral candidates to sign on to that. And we haven't quite done that if you take a look at that tape. So I would say that on the top. Some of the other issues that we talked about, related issues, not criminalizing mental health, is big and very related, making sure that treatment is available in a very rights-based, non-coercive way. So right now, our state is revisiting issues of trying to make commitment proceedings easier to undertake, outpatient, quote unquote, treatment easier to undertake. And we've had to fight that. So that's something else that's huge, getting support of mayoral candidates on that. Ensuring that they're the kind of supports for family supports, supports for community supports, I think is huge. Housing we spoke about, employment, both unemployment, underemployment, huge. And I'm closing by one more time repeating, non-police mental health crisis response, again, because it's that huge.
All right, Christina.
Okay. All right. So my question, first of all, I would start it with the people in our community, peer community. We always say nothing about us without us, right? And so my question would be to the candidate. With that said, would you consider having 51% peers at the decision-making table? Because it's important that we are part of the planning, designing, and implementation process of all programs and policies for New York City and for everything that relates to our community, period.
So much more we could discuss, but we're at time. And so I'm going to thank our panelists and pivot back to Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you so much. And thank you, Christina, Ruth, and Tim. This has been such a powerful and illuminating conversation, one that we could certainly keep having and should keep having, and undoubtedly parts of it will surface again in our next program on envisioning alternatives to policing and violence prevention on April 27th. So thank you so much for joining us. Take care and good night.
Bye, y'all. See you next month.
Bye.
Thank you very much.